Even as far back as the Romans, societies have debated what should be allowed to be seen and what should not. The city of Atlanta, Georgia was no different during the golden age of Hollywood. Throughout the 20th century, Atlanta had a censor who decided if films were appropriate to be played in city movie theaters. Between 1945 and 1964, that censor took the form of Mrs. Christine Smith Gillum. It was through her discretion that all movies were either approved to be shown in the city or banned from playing.
Christine was the third film censor for the city of Atlanta. She took the job in 1945 and served until 1964. She replaced Zella Richardson, who was the second film censor, who retired, and the Atlanta Public Library decided to accept applications, and there were 218 applications submitted for that particular job.
Christine Smith Gilliam was a native of Tennessee who wound up spending the bulk of her life in Atlanta. She attended Agnes Scott College. She got an MA in psychology at Emory University. She was the first paid leader of the League of Women's Voters in Atlanta.
She went through a series of tests, scored quite high on those tests, beat out two men for the position, and was appointed censor in 1945. There had been censorship in Atlanta since 1915, but there had not been a movie censorship bureau until 1944.
When the Atlanta Film Censorship Office was established, it was put under the Board of Directors of the Atlanta Public Library. But this was the same concept that was throughout the first censor, second censor, and through Christine Gilliam's tenure in office, that again she worked for the Atlanta Public Library, and we find Christine applying for the job in 1945. We find what I would call the professionalism of women in the public sphere, so that no longer are we saying that, oh, we'll respect women because of their moral authority. I believe that she was hired as the film censor in 1945 because of her professional background. She did not have a husband in 1945. She was not a Sunday school teacher in 1945. She didn't have children. She was not a member of the Women's Club, at least that I know of. But she was a member of the Atlanta chapter of the League of Women Voters. So there's this huge professionalism going, and I think that's the attitude that she starts off with, and I think that's the attitude she attempted to maintain throughout that whole period.
The whole structure of movie censorship in the United States was based on a 1915 Supreme Court ruling that decided that movies were not a form of expression. They were more like a circus, and they were not entitled to First Amendment free speech protection. They were subject to prior restraint. Atlanta was not, and Mrs. Smith Gilliam was not out of the mainstream in being a censor. This is something that was being done because movies were a relatively new and overwhelming form of mass media, and cultural and political leaders of various state and city bodies just weren't sure how to deal with it, how to control this. Atlanta had this overarching presence in movie distribution and movie culture in the Southeast. And so what was decided by the Atlanta censor could influence what other states or cities would decide to do with films. I mean, if you think about it, Atlanta is a great city, but it doesn't have a body of water, it doesn't have a river, it doesn't have a lake. Why is Atlanta a great city in the South? Because it had railroads. And the railroads meant that at the time when movies came out in 35 millimeter reels, they would have to be physically distributed by train across the country. So movies would come to Atlanta to be distributed to the Southeast.
Smith Gilliam's first year as Atlanta's official movie censor was far from easy. She went right to battle with the box office over her banning of the 1945 film Scarlet Street. Scarlet Street starred Joan Bennett and Edward G. Robinson. The noir tale culminates with the murder of Joan Bennett's character by Edward G. Robinson's character. Robinson's character faces no legal recourse, while another man is wrongly executed for the murder.
This was the first film she banned within 9 months 10 months of assuming her position as censor. This is a classic film noir. It's a morally ambiguous film, and she challenged it. In Atlanta, a major southeastern market whose censorship would influence adjacent states and their censorship of films or cities, the distributor decided to fight it. And in fact, there was a series of court cases to allow the film to be shown ultimately. But she dug in her heels. That Scarlet Street censorship case really set the tone for her relationship with Hollywood, and she continued to battle them going forward. There are ambiguities in characterization and in the way the narrative plays out that being a censor doesn't allow her to recognize or acknowledge. And a film like Scarlet Street is taking a stance that it's presenting life as it is. This is realistic because it's gritty, because it's unpleasant. But the idea that because Edward G. Robinson is the star of the film and his character is the protagonist, that we're automatically, a susceptible audience, is automatically want to do what he does is very ill-considered. And so there was a sense in which, like all censorship, there's a kind of itemization, a kind of checklist of what's going on in the film, and we can't have that without necessarily considering what's the overall effect.
The banning of Scarlet Street is a hallmark example of Smith-Gillam's mindset as a censor. It also reveals the audience she prioritized to protect at every step: children.
You know, during the time that she operated as censor, again, the third censor in Atlanta's history, movies were made for entire families. They were made for a general audience. So you could take your kids to see The Wizard of Oz. You might take your kids to Gone with the Wind. You wouldn't necessarily take your kids to see a noir film like Scarlet Street. And so she was coping with a situation in which movies were supposed to be made for entire audiences, but particularly in the post-war era, they became more complex morally, they became more sophisticated, they became more explicit. So she had a very combative attitude towards Hollywood, and she thought of herself as the protector of the city's youth and the city's public morals. Part of her studies, her graduate studies in psychology at Emory, she had focused on child psychology. This was truly the driving issue for her.
Another driving factor for Smith-Gillam as a censor was her relationship to Hollywood's production code. She often felt the code did not extend as far as it needed to protect the minds of viewers.
Mrs. Gilliam modeled her approach to censorship on Hollywood's production code, this 1930 document that specified the kinds of things that Hollywood movies could represent and should not represent, emphasis on what it should not show. But the general idea of the code was that it should not lower the moral standards of anyone watching a film. And so things like illicit sexual relationships could not be shown, crime without punishment could not be shown. So that was her approach.
One would hope by the time the films got to censors that they had been pretty much scrutinized or reviewed so that censors would not have much more to say about them. However, the Production Code Administration had become a little bit more liberal in their interpretations of the do's and don'ts of the production code. So by the time certain films got to Christine Smith, she would often be a bit more conservative or rigorous in terms of applying the production code standards to her evaluation.
Her feeling that they were out of step, they had abandoned these core moral values that the production code was designed to uphold, would also empower her. I've got to do this now because Hollywood's not doing it. They're not doing a good enough job of it. Her predecessor, Mrs. Alonzo Richardson, had a very cooperative attitude with Hollywood. She would write them, she would make her complaints in a very friendly way, but Christine Smith Gilliam did not have this friendly relationship. And as she continued to ban films or demand cuts from films, that opposition hardened.
So she seemed to be following her own dreams and aspirations, getting a master's degree, working. On the surface, I think, gosh, she was involved, she was a working woman, she was kind of breaking the mold for her time, and yet she still seemed in her decision-making to really hold fast to certain puritanical values about sex and what should be shown on the screen. But then she approved a lot of films to be shown, more films than she banned. And so I have a hard time kind of figuring out who she was in terms of gender, sex, racial politics even. She wasn't always consistent in those terms. So she kind of still remains an enigma to me in that way. Progressive in many ways, groundbreaking in some, and yet fairly conservative with a lowercase c overall.
She considered herself a professional, and many professionals, especially in the workplace, especially in corporations, tend to equate professionalism with a rigid attitude toward correct behavior and an inflexibility with regard to, let's make an exception here or let's make an exception here.
Smith-Gillam's rigidity did not only extend to banning murder and intrigue. With a changing racial landscape in Atlanta, she made pointed choices in what she allowed when it came to films that challenged race relations.
Atlanta was going through tremendous change. The urban regime, which was a coalition of white leaders and black leaders, were working together to make at least the image of Atlanta one of, as Mayor Hartsfield put it at the time, the city too busy to hate, one of progress, a city that was not having the same problems that other southern cities were having, really trying to distinguish Atlanta from the rest of the South. 1949 was a really interesting year in terms of film history. You had a slew of race-focused films come out in that time. So 4 years after the end of World War II, and anticipating what's coming in the 1950s in terms of Brown versus Board of Education. So a lot of these films almost anticipated the rhetoric of those decisions in the civil rights movement.
1949 also brought Smith-Gillam two race-related movies that resulted in two very different decisions: Lost Boundaries and Pinky. Pinky tells the story of a biracial woman passing as white named Pinky, who returns to the South. While home, she receives the property of an elderly white neighbor who passes away. Pinky must choose between returning to the North with her white lover or remaining in the South. Ultimately, Pinky decides to stay in the South, claims her black identity, and establishes a school for black children. While Smith-Gillam made a few cuts to the film, she passed Pinky on to Atlanta theaters.
It's very much following other stories, passing narratives, passing films, really from the Harlem Renaissance forward, in which when a character who has been passing claims their given identity, their assigned identity, they are usually rewarded in some way. In those what are often termed tragic mulatto narratives, in which a woman can't make peace with her identity and tries to claim whiteness, which technically with one-drop rule was not allowed, she is punished in some way.
In contrast, Lost Boundaries is the story of a respected local doctor and his family who also pass for white. When forced to reveal their biracial identities to their town, they are ultimately accepted and integrated into the white community. This film, unlike Pinky, was banned by Smith-Gillam.
From what I've gathered, she banned Lost Boundaries for a few reasons. I think that partly it's that narrative that in the end, this family that has rejected its given racial identity and then been allowed to come back regardless of having done that, you know, it's suggestive of integration. There is an allusion to interracial mixing between the children and their current boyfriend and girlfriend. And so for her, it disturbed the status quo too much. Pinky, in the line or in the vein of the tragic mulatto narrative, doesn't do that. It upholds the status quo. Pinky was assigned a black identity at birth. She tried to pass as white. She comes back. She claims her given identity. And so all boundaries remain in check. At this time, biracial identity, multiracial identity was not allowed really to exist or to be claimed, even though technically that probably is who that what the character's identity would have been based on history. So due to the one-drop rule, she would have been black. So when she doesn't claim that, it's problematic. when she does claim it, finally in the end, it reinforces the boundaries. She's created a black school for black children in the black part of town. She's no longer mixing with her white boyfriend, so the boundaries remain intact. And Christine Smith seemed really intent on that, keeping the boundaries in place.
When she allowed Pinky to be shown, she said something on the order of, "I think it shows us how unlovely some of our attitudes are." But Pinky could be shown because the passing character, who's biracial, asserts her black identity. She's not trying to pass by the end of the film. And so that was less offensive at the time.
We're so business-minded and we're so focused on the future and on growth that racism and racial issues don't have a place here. We don't have the same, quote, problems, that Little Rock or Birmingham or other places have. So in some ways, I see Smith-Gilliam as working to protect that image of Atlanta as this peaceful place where there is really no, at least in ideal, racial tension or division. Of course, we know from Atlanta historians that while all this was happening, there were great divides being created politically, economically, socially between white and black communities in Atlanta. She was so keen on policing these films so as not to incite any kind of conflict or riot or racial disturbance. That was sort of in service of this image of Atlanta. But it also reflects in some ways her lack of progressive views and lack of progressive action in terms of really taking on racism and race more broadly in the United States, as was being done through film. So films were challenging these norms. Films were challenging the culture of segregation before, like in 1949, before the advent of the modern civil rights movement, but she was deciding what got put on screen and what didn't.
Besides tackling the issue of race in film, Smith-Gilliam dealt with changing attitudes and opening minds about what could be shown in movies. She also faced major legal decisions that affected the rest of her time as a censor and eventually brought its downfall.
In 1915, the U.S. Supreme Court says that film is not protected by the First Amendment. Okay, well, throughout our first tenure and throughout the second tenure, fine. But when Christine takes over in 1945, in 1952, the U.S. Supreme Court changes its mind, reverses its opinion in Mutual Film versus Industrial Commission of Ohio, and the case in 1952 is called Joseph Burstyn, Inc. versus Wilson, and the U.S. Supreme Court says film is protected by the First Amendment. You think, what are all these different things that are attracting the American audiences, because they're, European audiences are loving them too. And Christine Gilliam, I think, finds herself in free fall. Now that's my assumption here, but I think so. You have the Hollywood corporations that are starting to file lawsuit far more frequently than they did when film was not protected by the First Amendment. What you find then is that city governments, state governments, Atlanta government really doesn't want to pay to defend these types of things.
A lot of people were supportive of her, were glad she was there. Other people were more questioning, especially after World War II, since we had been fighting against fascism, we had been fighting against authoritarianism, and the idea of letting one person decide what Atlanta residents could see and not see on the screen seemed entirely anti-democratic, which it was. And in some of these cases, when Christine Smith-Gilliam banned a film, they were films that were allowed to play in other places. So what's the problem with Atlanta? What's the problem with her? And so that was another kind of criticism that she was subject to. So she was very hardworking, very diligent, very conscientious, very self-assured, and also very self-conscious when it came to publicity. And that could not have made her job easier.
The controversial bannings of British film Room at the Top and Greek film Never on Sunday marked the beginning of the end for the censor's office. Released in 1959, Room at the Top covered the story of a working-class man who tries to sleep his way up the social hierarchy, ending in the death of the leading lady.
It's getting all kinds of accolades, but Mrs. Smith-Gilliam was not having it. She objected to certain kinds of language, sort of explicit language about picking women up. She objected to the fact that the sexually intimate scenes were actually shown on camera. I mean, there was no explicit sex, but you actually showed them in bed together, lying together, talking. And to her, this was just going way too far. So she banned that.
The more significant legal challenge, however, came from 1960 film Never on Sunday. The movie follows an Athenian prostitute and her time with an American tourist.
Mrs. Christine Smith-Gilliam decides that certain cuts must be made, but then the board looks at it on appeal and they decide the whole film should be banned. These two bannings occasioned resistance from the distributors, who actually sued the city, demanding that the films be allowed to be shown under the First Amendment. With Never on Sunday, Judge Luther Alverson ruled that the film was not obscene and that the ban should be removed. The plaintiffs, the distributor, had asked for an injunction against the ban. But then in September of 1961, the Georgia Supreme Court ruled that the distributors should not have asked for an injunction. They should have asked Luther Alverson for his own judgment as to whether or not the film was obscene. So the ban was reinstated. She comes under increased scrutiny. Trade magazines are writing articles about her. The local newspapers are writing pieces about her. So she was very defensive about that. In her ideal scenario, she would do her work quietly and no one would notice and there would be no fuss.
So you can just imagine that Christine Gilliam is having a bit of a tough time at this point. She's starting to lose cases. Some of the courts are ruling against her. She's not getting much support from the city of Atlanta because this is tax money. We don't want to spend it if we don't have to here.
Meanwhile, you have these two low-budget films, Birth of Twins and Wasted Lives, that are being shown at a notorious drive-in in Fayetteville, south of the city. And these get challenged, these get banned, and so these go up to the Georgia Supreme Court, and the Georgia Supreme Court rules that censoring these movies violates the state constitution's guarantee of free speech.
The great quote here is the Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court, Chief Justice Duckworth, said that you can't burn down the house to get the rats out. And that was that major nail in the coffin for film censorship.
These major court decisions took place in 1962 and eventually ended Christine Smith-Gilliam's power as a censor. However, she remained at the Atlanta Public Library with a new movie-related title until her resignation in 1964.
There was some discussion later on when it became clear that First Amendment and the right of free speech and these objections to films being censored started getting in the way. There was some discussion about moving her to another position in the Atlanta Public Library, but she really wasn't qualified as a librarian. And then there was some discussion, at least brief discussion, about another position within Atlanta city government, and there was not. Nothing found there either.
So they actually changed her role from motion picture censor to motion picture reviewer, and she worked for a few more months, classifying films in terms of whether they were appropriate to children, young audiences. In other words, she was working in a way on a prototype of a classification system, which is what the film industry would eventually adopt in 1968.
It wasn't so much that she was not doing a good job, not doing the job she was assigned. It's this shift where she starts becoming the bad guy. She starts being portrayed in the media and in public discussions as the bad person. And then we start getting into the idea that the library is a bad guy, and we get into the idea that librarians support censorship. And so they were really starting to have trouble with that concept of this is her job, and she's doing it as part of the library system. In other words, she became more rigidly, I hate to say conservative, but certainly more rigidly legalistic. And librarians were become more open-minded and recognizing that all sorts of great works of literature have certain different issues involved with them. And so you get this sort of division here where the library doesn't want her anymore, but doesn't quite know what to do with her. So, she loses her power and again resigns. I think she resigned in frustration. I think if you read some of the coverage of her after this, you'll find a fairly frustrated person. As a matter of fact, I even might go so far as to say somewhat bitter on occasions. Everything starts to change, and Christine doesn't. I mean, I believe that when you look at who she is and the position she took and her expertise, you'll find that she had a standard that she upheld and she did not change. And so society changes, she's not changing. And so we tend to sort of, wash our hands of people who don't change. And so I feel like that's sort of how she ended up where she was.
When she retired, she remarked, "I don't think I'm going to go to the movies for a while. I need to wash the taste of them out of my mouth." So she was pretty appalled with Hollywood, and she was pretty appalled with Atlanta and Georgia not being able to support her.
Christine Gilliam's husband was a city alderman. So somehow I think she expected to have a little better treatment at the hands of the city government of Atlanta than she received.
As someone once said, as always in a protection racket, there's something much greater in for the person doing the protecting than the person being protected. And censorship is all about the exercise of cultural power, moral cultural power. And I think once you're given that kind of authority, it's very, very hard to give it up, especially if you truly believe, as she did, that her services were needed in Atlanta.
Smith Gilliam died in 1971 after having viewed an estimated 4,500 films and banning 107. But the effects of this period of movie censorship can still be felt today.
You start to think, oh, that censorship and that kind of thing was something from 1962. So we're done with that. But I think in this era, we see that even when those things changed legally 60 years ago now, that we're still having the same debates about freedom of speech.
Information is very powerful. Mass media are very powerful. So you're always going to have these arguments, video games, whatever it is, television, before television was comic books, about what is appropriate for people to see. But I think what's marvelous about looking back at Mrs. Smith Gilliam is recognizing this heritage of a time when free speech was highly limited.
The question always comes up of what is the cultural work that media does? What role does it perform in our society? Does it act on us independently of our minds? Does it, work its magic on us? Are we always interacting with it, or is it shaping our views in some ways, perhaps even more than we know? And so I think what she showed in her decisions is that she recognized that these films had the power to change hearts and minds in ways that maybe she did not want to see happen. And so we continue to have those conversations today about what is the value of art, what is the value of media, what does it have the power to do? And those conversations are the same as they were. And people are still making decisions as to what is seen and who is seen and what is said and what is not said. And I don't know if we'll ever not be having those conversations.